So sorry about the video. It's it's really difficult dealing with this mode camera. There's a lot of driver issues and a lot of lighting issues, as you can tell. I'm also doing this late in the day, so the light from I usually get this diffused light from the window that's a lot more pleasant to the eye, and you don't get these hot spots. So yeah, sorry about that, but I don't think most of you care. And whoever watches these videos. So there's a lot to talk about, and recently, the last couple of days, I've been feeling really anxious about talking about stuff. I don't know exactly why. I've just been a little bit out to lunch, not in the sense of being, absent-minded, but in the sense of not being present in reciprocal conversations, and not really having the stamina to actually say much. So that kind of plays into the whole thing as well. But I've been reading a lot, and I've been looking into a number of different issues as they've come up, even if they were on an ad hoc basis. So I eventually want to get to something that I want to talk about. A number of things. There's one main thing, which is basically the ethics involved in technology. And it won't be a very in-depth observation. It's almost going to be kind of how would you say, I don't know, a bit of a superficial take on ethics and technology. I think it'll mostly be things that we've all considered before, but things that, while we may have considered them, still carry this kind of like folk law or folk philosophy kind of bent to it, that doesn't actually play out in real life. So we're all mostly two-minded about a lot of things. We understand intellectually what things mean, especially when it comes down to legal frameworks and government and a sort of technocratic way of looking at things. But then we also have our everyday lives and the way things pan out that way. And I've found in the last couple of years there's a lot of things that kind of have this duplicitous nature when it comes to explaining them, because there's a theoretical approach and a practical approach that seem to be at odds with each other a lot of times. Anyway, there was another minor issue I wanted to kind of bring to light, and it was, you know what, let me look it up on my phone because I can't really remember right now. Let's see. Sorry, I'm putting that Timothy Chalamet kind of, thing right now. Look at my beautiful face as I go through all this Facebook stuff. Right, I saw this. This is what I wanted to kind of get to on a initial basis before I went into the ethics of technology. So in Morocco, there's apparently this movement of women scholars who are tackling Islamic extremism through spreading through their unique channels of getting information out there. And it's kind of talking about, they have a name for them. Can't seem to find it right now, but the article was in the Atlantic, and Morchadat, whatever that means, they've been, so basically that's the word describing female Islamic scholars that have these unique channels to the community by merely being women, that can allow for a dissemination of more moderate interpretations of Islam. So this is going to be a bit simplistic because I think a lot of people talk about the duplicity of understanding things and having it work out in real life. But you do think about, well, why are they attacking Islamic extremism from an Islamic perspective? It seems kind of foolish. It feels like there should be an outside source of morality, which there is, like, theoretically there is an outside source of morality when it comes to not looking to holy doctrine and holy books or whatever for a compass on what should be done and not be done, etc., etc. I mean, you look at some holy text and you think, well, obviously stoning people for various crimes isn't actually done anymore. Cutting off people's hands for certain crimes isn't done anymore because we've moved past it. So why look to these doctrines for redemption, for redemption, or for altering the way people behave when reading the doctrine? Like, it's to a certain extent, I guess, on a more nuanced level, they're kind of maybe in a sort of impromptu way, kind of invalidating the doctrine by spreading this moderatism. And let's not forget that in Islamic countries or within the Islamic context, moderatism is a very different thing when you talk about adherence to religion and religious doctrine. It's different in Christianity as it's different for Islamism or in the Islamic context. So there's why look to doctrine to invalidate doctrine? It's kind of this Sisyphean sort of kind of task to take on. It seems kind of foolish, and if there are effects and understanding why moderatism might temporarily halt extremism, you could validate their efforts that way. But in any sane context, you would think, well, that would generally just be a very temporary measure, because once you start validating doctrine, I mean, I'm sure there's ways Morchadats talk about doctrine that validate doctrine. There's this fuzzy area, right? Like, I mean, what are they actually saying? But people with an axe to grind can look at the same doctrine and pull out a lot of shit from the same doctrine, and there's a lot there. You could write pages about it, basically, in terms of legal matters and societal matters and matters of ethics and morality, etc., etc. I mean, the same can be said about the Bible, blah blah blah. But in the Islamic context, and when it comes down to extremism and tackling extremism, it's a very fuzzy area to be in. Generally, I think what they're doing is they're validating doctrine all over again. This time with a feminist bent. So even better now. So I think that's what's going on there. I think there are a lot of naysayers that actually don't believe that terrorism is a religious matter. They don't believe that extremism or fundamentalism, etc., is a fundamentalist, or fundamentalism is a religious matter, which is kind of absurd to think about. To think about somebody who thinks that way is just very absurd and very kind of not really aligning itself with reality. It's very strange. That's not Islam. That's not Christianity. That's. But they're pulling from the same doctrine, and the way they act, as Yasmin Muhammad would say from the secular jihadists from the Middle East. Like, I mean, if you notice, and a lot of people say this too, but if you look at what they're doing, it aligns itself perfectly with doctrine. When you look at what fundamentalists are doing, it actually aligns itself very, very strictly with doctrine, and in a lot of cases, fundamentalists have a more honest view of doctrine than moderate people do, moderate religionists. That does happen. So you do wonder, right? Like, I mean, now there's all this other stuff about rehabilitation when it comes to former terrorists, etc., etc., and some of it applies to being radicalized in the first place. I mean, there's a multi-pronged effort that you could put forth in dealing with radicalism or with extremism or fundamentalism, blah blah blah, or radicalism specifically speaking. But that multi-pronged project is actually very inefficient and very ineffective when you think about what the logistics of it, right? If you think about surveillance as one approach to radicalism, who do you surveil? Like, who do you surveil and for how long? Like, I mean, there are certain rights and freedoms when it comes to privacy and freedom of expression and freedom of religion that people have. It's built into the Bill of Rights, and it's built into the Constitution, and rights and freedoms, sorry, in Canada, but it's built into the Constitution. Like, I mean, privacy is a human right. So there's lots of hurdles to overcome, and you can't single out certain citizens for doing certain things that look a certain way, blah blah blah, because you're talking about, to begin with, even if you're not, if there's valid cause to surveil somebody, it's a human right. Privacy is a human right, and privacy is also built into our legal framework and our criminal code, etc., etc. So I mean, there's lots of hurdles to overcome. Less the ones of deciding who to surveil and where does it end once you start surveilling. But there's economic costs to surveilling. It's very expensive. How many people do you hire on to keep following various people around, etc., etc.? Like, how many rights and freedoms can we give up before it becomes impractical? So it's on that front, on a legal front, or it's very expensive. It's just not practical. And if you really want to change radicalization of young men or women or whatever, the most efficient way is to basically attack the root cause. And I'm saying attack, but I don't mean like attack in some violent way. I'm talking about reformation, and I think there's a lot of Muslims and ex-Muslims that work to reform interpretations of Islam, which I don't completely agree with, as I've said previously or just a few minutes ago. So don't get me wrong. I think reformation is something that could be used temporarily, but I don't think that reformation necessarily gives binding reasons for not being radicalized. You're essentially just dealing with the same stuff. The same resume is still in the works. Like, you're still reading the same pages with the same doctrine that led to radicalization in the first place. So I don't necessarily believe in reformation. And sometimes I go back. Sometimes I go back and forth on that one. But I just don't see. I think, as Sam Harris would say, there's better reasons to live moral, ethical lives than religious ones. Obviously, because religion, well, it can be interpreted, right? So anyway, that's my whole thing on that. Sometimes I feel too there's this Western liberal or Western leftist kind of dealy going on when it comes to incentive for radicalization or incentive for extremist and fundamentalist interpretations of religious doctrine. They, on some levels, some people on the left agree that that there is incentive for conservative or fundamentalist or extremist religious followings because they've been battered by colonialism, etc., etc., etc. But on the other hand, they're saying, well, it's not incentivized on the side of colonial suppression, blah blah blah. It's just for U.S. foreign policy. So I mean, it depends on how far back on history you want to go, but I mean, sometimes they say that it is incentivized because of colonial suppression or repression or whatever. But then on the other hand, it's not colonial suppression or repression or whatever. It's U.S. foreign policy. So are extremists or radicalists or fundamentalists incentivized on some level by doctrine? No, well, it's religion. They're not, but they are. But it's all American U.S. foreign policy done. Anyway, it's something I'm still working out, but I see it happen a lot of times. Anyway, that one is basically how far back you want to go throughout history. But if you think about ISIS, who have been defeated, but I mean, they're still in the Philippines and they still have their associate groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, blah blah blah. They never really were defeated, but they do exhibit. I forgot my train of thought, but they do exhibit this colonial sort of incentive for radicalization or for trying to start the new caliphate, right? they do the Sykes-Picot sign that they held up, blah blah blah. The boundary, the colonial boundaries and borders, blah blah blah. Anyway, so there's I don't know how people on the left or Western liberals think about in incentivizing or non-incentivizing religious extremism. It's a very blurry line they play. Anyway, on to the main topic. What I wanted to talk about was ethics and technology. ISIS, for instance, they use technology very pervasively, or they used to, or they still do. Al-Shabaab and Hezbollah and Boko Haram and Al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda, they all use new media technologies with a lot of ethics in mind, almost too much ethics in some cases. Sometimes it's a religious morality they're using, sometimes it's a technocratic morality that they're using, but they're using it to spread their ethics and their values and their morality. On the other hand, you have people like my mother, for instance, who definitely talks about, well, if you don't want anything to get out there, you don't use Facebook. And I've posted stuff on Facebook that my mother has told me, take it down. It's what I'm trying to get at is basically ethics are definitely involved in new media technologies and in technology in general. You think about things like Stuxnet, derailing Iranian hopes and dreams for a nuclear program. You're talking about algorithms. Like, we're all just talking about algorithms. Or even if you don't want to talk about algorithms, you're talking about hardware. Like, you think about the helicopter, the Bell helicopter deal that fell through with Duterte in the Philippines. That was because of ethical reasons, right? So on whatever level there's ethics being injected into our technology these days, people just don't see the online realm in the same way they view real life. So something like physical violence is seen differently when seen through an online filter. Obviously, that's the basics of new media, right? If you see it online, it's the ethical compass kind of goes a little bit off to the left or a little bit off to the right. We're not too clear on what's exactly happening because we're just reviewing screens, reviewing algorithms, right? So your mother's advice of not putting anything on Facebook is saying kind of a dubious thing. It's on one level, it's saying, well, there's an amorality to the online world. There's an amorality to algorithms and drone strikes, etc., etc. There's an amorality because these things don't get considered once in the world of technology because it doesn't affect you physically in some cases maybe not, blah 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 blah. But it's kind of like the Wild West out there when it comes to morality in the online world or technology in general, right? Because we don't have to really deal with it. It's just a screen we're seeing. We don't come to physical harm or anything like that. But Facebookistan has its disclaimers and but at the same time saying, well, use it at your own risk. They're also saying, well, we have privacy filters and only your friends can see this stuff, blah blah blah. So is there ethics in the online world? Definitely, absolutely. Without doubt, there is ethics to new media technologies. It's just that enforceability is very difficult, especially these days. You look at basically like the Toronto police, for instance, who are still, I don't know how far along they've come with this sort of stuff, but they're still struggling with online ethics, with online crimes. You look at banks and other major entities that interact with the public, and they have these very strict rules about privacy and information sharing and who they share it to. And it goes all over the spectrum, right? Like how moral is it to share your client's personal data with ad agencies? It's you can look back at something like Stuxnet, which is basically derailing or dealing a blow to Iranian centrifuges. Basically, ethics do exist in technology. It's just that it's kind of a curtained kind of thing that we see. We don't see real people. And this has kind of existed for a long time. Like you think about other mediums like the news or blah blah blah. There's a veil that drops in front of you when you're behind the computer, just seeing algorithms basically. But it's not to say that ethics don't exist. I think it's just a more of an abstracted thing that we see, and it's New media, by definition, is this kind of like constantly being abstracted kind of medium, right? To the point where the baseline of what's actually happening is kind of blurred and visible a lot of times. So, ethics do exist. Your mother's advice is to be taken with a grain of salt. And there are certain things that some people won't do and will do online. Some people are better at understanding what's going on behind that screen. Others are not. And it has a lot to do with human capacity as well. So while it might be a technological context, we're still talking about human beings using it. So there's an ethical mindset somewhere involved. There's you're inputting, you're outputting, you're involved in the whole situation. Anyway, so good things happen too. I remember reading this book by Roy Ascott called "Is There Love in the Telematic Embrace?" How appropriate! It's Valentine's Day, yay! But is there love in the telematic embrace? And they were talking about this one installation that connected via satellite people in Toronto and people in Vancouver through these life-sized screen projections of passersby on the street, and you had family reunions happening at these big screens, etc., etc. People in Vancouver and Toronto, etc., etc. So I mean, there's good, there's bad, but ethics are involved. It's just that people are a bit blurry when they're behind a fucking electron gun or a liquid crystal display. So I mean, things get kind of iffy in that realm. But anyway, that's all I want to say. I also have to really pee, so I'm going to end this video now. And sorry for the sound. I think the sound is going to be all off because I'm using different software, etc., etc. But I think the sound might be a little bit off. But anyway, bye.